Alright, so today's figure is going to be far more philosophical than the ones we have gone over so far with Henry Hunt, William Cobbett, and the Spenceans. John Stuart Mill doesn't really come up in our story of parliamentary reform until the 1867 Act, where he famously introduced an amendment to the bill which changed the word male, which had been introduced in the 1832 Great Reform Act, to man, which was essentially referring to mankind, so it technically gave women the vote. Lots of people think that he failed in this, but this is not true. He succeeded and he got the amendment through, so he successfully technically enfranchised women with that. But unfortunately, as you likely know, it didn't really work, and that was mainly because of the Interpretations Act of 1850 meant that his amendment would technically give barnyard animals the vote, and it essentially made a mockery of it. And essentially the reviewing barristers, because the 1867 Act introduced the political register where you had to register to vote, it meant that the reviewing barristers who were signing off people's names onto these lists to make sure they could vote, a lot of them would turn away women. So, although they technically had the vote due to John Stuart Mill's actions, unfortunately they were not allowed to vote. However, contrary to popular belief, many did in that election. And famously, Lily Maxwell, I believe, was one of the women to vote. And there is a very fun story about a conservative who was quite annoyed that in his constituency there were a number of women who had made it through the political register and the barrister system, essentially because the barrister thought their name sounded like they were a man, so they were given the vote. But obviously, the ones that got through during this election, the Conservative was essentially not pleased that the vast majority of them were voting Liberal, and I believe the suffrage movement, the activists like Lydia Becker, I remember she was there, proposed to him that he should hire a carriage to get one of her friends out to vote whom had also made it to the political register. And obviously this gentleman paid for her carriage so she could come down and give him a vote. So it's an interesting story. Let's get into John Stuart Mill. He lived between 1806 and 1873. How he brought liberal thoughts into law, remembering that John Stuart Mill was a transitional liberal, so like a mix between classical liberal and modern liberal in the sense that he was slightly utilitarian. Unfortunately, I do believe there are some aspects to utilitarianism that can hold up to scrutiny, but much of it is just wishful thinking. We'll get more into it when we discuss Jeremy Bentham and his philosophy, him being the main utilitarian. So, John Stuart Mill played a significant role in the passing of the 1867 Representation of the People's Act, so essentially the 1867 Great Reform Act. This piece of legislation amended the anomaly of the 1832 Act, which replaced the word man with male, and thus officially disenfranchised women under a parliamentary statute. He amended this anomaly in 1867, using the word man again, which allowed some women, such as Lily Maxwell, to vote, so that's what we just talked about. He also worked closely with Lydia Becker and the suffrage societies. And in Helen Blackburn's record of the women's suffrage movement, she talks about how during his life he was probably the greatest friend to the women's suffrage movement. So, that's good to know. The transition from classical to modern liberalism. John Stuart Mill disagreed with some of the tenets of classical liberalism, hence why he is often described as marking the transitional phase from Lockean classical liberalism and Rawlsian modern liberalism. Mill believed in negative liberty, which was effectively the lack of restraint put onto an individual by the state. This feeds into the classical liberal notion of tolerance, but it expands upon it by relating the liberties an individual should be entitled to with the harm principle, which states that one's actions should not infringe upon the rights of others. This is evidently an expansion of Mill's utilitarianism, as the harm principle relates to hedonic calculus, and this idea of being free to do as you please, providing you do not restrict the rights of others, would be expounded by numerous philosophers over the course of the 19th century. So if you don't know, hedonic calculus is essentially a load of principles espoused by Jeremy Bentham, essentially the principles of utilitarian thought, and they're used to weigh what would be moral, so what brings the least harm. I believe fecundity. There are loads of them. We'll get onto it when we do Jeremy Bentham another time. So, most notably, Friedrich Nietzsche, whom quantified this principle in his idea of the will to power over oneself, and this should not be achieved. And should this not be achieved, this will to power will manifest itself as a will to power over others. So that's essentially saying that someone should have a desire to improve upon themselves as much as they can, so they exert their power trying to better their lives and not exerting that power over others. And if they fail to do this, the will to power over oneself manifests in the will to power over others, which essentially why we see stuff like, domestic abuse and such. So, Mill and the individual. John Stuart Mill had the view that the individual should strive towards bettering itself. From this, Mill deduced that the individual should take charge of one's life and educate themselves in spite of the misery that often comes from cultivating an intellect. So this idea was quantified in his statement that it is better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a pig satisfied. Arthur Schopenhauer is also an important figure to examine regarding developmental individualism, as his claim that all great minds are condemned to loneliness seems to support the idea that cultivating an intellect is a perilous endeavour. Mill's developmental individualism is also very similar to Søren Kierkegaard's proposition that one must strive to become an individual by effort, and anxiety is the natural result of this process. So if you're in your bedroom now and you're thinking about how you can get the best grades in your exam, why do you want to do that? To get a successful career in the future, maybe start a family, and you probably feel anxiety that you won't do it. Well, that anxiety is the thing that pushes you to go and be like, I believe there's a quote by Bertrand Russell saying that time you enjoyed wasting isn't truly wasted. Well, that can partially be true, but if you are spending all this time doing something that you enjoy, say a hobby, and you're neglecting more pressing matters, then you're going to feel anxious while you're essentially procrastinating, so you're not really enjoying that time. So you have to be careful how you interpret Bertrand Russell's language there. Mill believed that in order to achieve the status as an individual, one must avoid the carnal desires of the flesh common to animals, and should instead focus on the higher pursuits of mankind, such as the pursuit of knowledge. So you can see there, Mill very much supports the idea that one should be reading a lot of books, improving on yourself, becoming the best possible version of yourself, being better than others, not allowing yourself to become lost in the infinite, becoming essentially an individual. And to be an individual, you're not born one, you have to earn that through hard effort, which is obviously very true. So, Mill and the tyranny of the majority. The principle of developmental individualism effectively produces a distinction between the individual and a self-individuated being. Ultimately, as the number of cultivated men in a society is likely to be less than the uncultivated, the cultivated can be tyrannized by the majority. This is why Mill disliked democracy, believing that a meritocratic oligarchy would be better at governing a nation, an idea that would be taken up by Robert Heinlein in Starship Troopers. Now, I just want to point out that by a meritocratic oligarchy, it means power is centralized within a few people. It can be democratic, but essentially not everyone has the vote, it's within a few individuals, and meritocratic means they have to earn that status. So in Starship Troopers, like I mentioned with Robert Heinlein, people have to serve in the military to prove that they are willing to put the needs of the body politic above the needs of themselves to get the vote, which is an example of a meritocratic oligarchy. But John Stuart Mill was more of an intellectual meritocratic oligarchy where only essentially the philosopher kings should have the vote. And as Karl Popper said, that's obviously very tantalizing to philosophers because it gives them a lot of power. Once again, Nietzsche also believed that a class of Übermensch should run society, whom have developed via transitioning from camel, lion, and baby. This essentially the phases of development Friedrich Nietzsche gives in his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, of how someone goes from being essentially a part of the collective, so all their beliefs, thoughts are just put onto them by society, and they're just holding it up on their back. They eventually transition to the lion, if they make it that far, where they reject everything society tells them, and then eventually, when they become an Übermensch, essentially a Superman above the rest of society, which they have achieved through hard effort, they are akin to a baby who is willing to accept new ideas that seem logical and reject old ones that seem illogical, and vice versa. So, this was not an original proposition by Mill, as it dates back to the idea of philosopher kings from Plato's Republic, which is a very interesting book I recommend you read if you're ever going to do politics or philosophy. Essentially, I believe the term is Socratic communism. It's very proto-Marxist, but I digress. Unsurprisingly, many philosophers like this idea. And as I said before, that's a quote from Karl Popper, a German philosopher. So, a summary on Mill. His famous works were On Liberty, Utilitarianism, and A System of Logic, and his core ideas were freedom of speech, transitional liberalism, developmental individualism, formal equality under the law, utilitarianism, higher and lower desires, and natural rights. So that's it for John Stuart Mill. He'll come up when we do the 1867 Great Reform Act with Gladstone and Disraeli. But until then, that's all we'll be going over for Mill. Thank you.